The fluorescent lights of the fellowship hall hummed. Sarah, standing beside Pastor Dale, looked past Frank as if he were just part of the wall paneling. He'd driven an hour to find her, heart in his throat. When he reached for her hand, she flinched, pulling away, her gaze flickering to Dale. "He just doesn't understand," Dale said, his voice a calm rumble, a patronizing hand settling on Sarah's shoulder. "Some men never do." Frank stood alone, exposed, the quiet laughter of strangers like a physical blow. Frank first saw Sarah in Mrs. Jenkins's history class, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sun through the window. They were 16 then, high school sweethearts who always just figured they'd end up together. After graduation, that's exactly what happened. They settled into a small, sturdy house on the edge of town in rural Utah, a place with a wide-open sky and enough land for a decent garden. It was a good life, simple and steady. Frank worked construction, his hands growing calloused from framing houses and pouring foundations. It was honest sweat for honest pay. Enough to keep the bills paid and the refrigerator full. Their modest home was always clean, the scent of Sarah's cooking often drifting out to greet him when he pulled up his old Ford pickup after a long day. He pictured little shoes by the door, drawings taped to the fridge. That was the dream, the simple blueprint for their future. A house full of kids, the sound of small feet pattering on the floorboards. It wasn't a grand plan, but it felt right. A natural progression of their life together. They tried for years. Frank never thought much of it. Figured it would just happen when it happened. But after 5 years, a quiet unease began to settle between them. Sarah made the first appointment. They both went in for tests. Frank's came back clean, the doctor's voice flat and clinical as he read the results. Sarah's, however, was different. He remembered the way she'd looked coming out of the examining room, her face pale, eyes holding a distant kind of pain. Later that evening, after the doctor's words had settled like stones in the quiet of their living room, she finally spoke. "It's a dry uterus, Frank," she said, her voice thin, barely a whisper. She looked at her hands, folded tight in her lap. "I can't give you children." Frank just held her, the words hanging heavy in the air. His own dream, the one they'd built together, felt like a balloon slowly losing air, deflating and drifting away. He felt a hollowness open up inside him, but he pushed it down. Sarah was hurting. That was what mattered. He gave up on biological children then, or at least he told himself he did. It was easier to focus entirely on Sarah's happiness, to try and mend the part of her that felt broken. They talked about adoption for a while, a few quiet evenings over instant coffee. But Sarah had recoiled from the idea almost immediately. "It just wouldn't be mine," she'd said, her voice strained, a tightness around her mouth he hadn't seen before. I just couldn't raise a child that wasn't mine." The conversation died there, leaving another silent space between them. Frank tried to compensate. He'd take her out to dinner at the diner in town on Friday nights, or they'd drive out to the reservoir and watch the sun set over the distant mountains. He tried to keep the spark alive, the easy closeness they'd always shared. They made love almost daily, a quiet ritual, a silent hope for a miracle that Frank knew, deep down, wouldn't come. It was a way to feel close, to pretend everything was normal, even as the absence of a future child loomed larger in their quiet home. Sarah, meanwhile, started filling her days. First, it was more time at the beauty salon, then the new gym that opened down the road. She started jogging, her figure growing leaner, more defined. Frank would see her come back, sweat on her brow, her face flushed, but there was a restless energy about her, a look in her eyes that wasn't quite peace. She was always moving, always doing something, as if to outrun a stillness Frank couldn't quite name. One afternoon, Sarah came home from her jog, glowing in a way Frank hadn't seen in a while. Not the flushed glow of exertion, but something different, more internal. Her friend Karen Walsh was with her, sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of water. Karen had always been quiet, but now she had a new, fervent intensity about her, a brightness in her eyes. "You should come with me, Sarah," Karen said, her voice soft but insistent. "It's different, really. The church, it's not like anything else. And Pastor Dale." She leaned in, almost whispering. He just understands things. Things you wouldn't believe. Sarah looked from Karen to Frank, a vague yearning in her eyes, a question. Frank just nodded, trying to be supportive, not really thinking much of it. A week later, she agreed to attend a service with Karen, just to see. Sarah found Pastor Dale Peterson immediately captivating. He wasn't like anyone Frank had ever seen in their small town. Dale moved with a confident stride, his dark suit tailored precisely, a silver watch gleaming at his wrist. His hair was thick and dark, slicked back, and his smile was broad, encompassing everyone and no one, all at once. He spoke with a rich, resonant voice, filling the sanctuary without a microphone. Frank was a quiet man, deliberate in his movements and words. Dale was a force, something entirely different. He preached about love and forgiveness, about finding redemption and purpose. His sermons were polished, weaving together scripture and personal anecdotes with an effortless grace. But beneath the spiritual message, Frank sensed an underlying air of wealth and influence. The church itself was new, gleaming, with plush pews and stained glass that shimmered even on cloudy days. Dale carried himself like a man who commanded respect, not just asked for it. It was a polished veneer, something Frank couldn't quite place, but it settled in his gut. "I feel like I've found something, Frank," Sarah announced a few weeks after her first visit. Her eyes were bright, almost feverish. She was already attending services almost daily, sometimes twice a day. The church had become her new focus, pushing out the gym, the beauty salon, even their quiet evenings together. She was spellbound by Pastor Dale's words, recounting his sermons with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Frank started noticing the shift first in the small ways. Less time spent talking over dinner, fewer evenings sitting on the porch swing. Intimacy grew scarce. Sarah would come home from church, her face drained but her eyes still burning, distant and tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. She was there, in the house, but a part of her seemed to be somewhere else entirely. "Sarah, I feel you slipping away," Frank ventured one evening, watching her pick at her dinner. The words felt heavy, hard to push out. "Since you started with this church, it feels like we're not us anymore." She looked up, a small, almost pitying smile touching her lips. It wasn't angry, not exactly, but it was distant. "That's just your imagination, darling. I'm serving God. This is important work." She dabbed her mouth with a napkin, her gaze already drifting. Trying to understand, to bridge the growing chasm between them, Frank agreed to attend a service with her. He pulled on his best shirt, the one she'd given him for Christmas. The church was indeed beautiful, the light filtering through the stained glass in rich jewel tones. Pastor Dale was as handsome as Sarah had described, his presence commanding the room. His preaching was powerful, his voice rising and falling with practiced ease, drawing the congregation in. He spoke of faith, of sacrifice, of a path to salvation. Frank listened, trying to find the words that had so captivated his wife, but something felt off to him, a performance he couldn't quite place. It was like watching a perfectly executed play, where every gesture, every intonation, felt rehearsed, the passion felt manufactured. Too perfect. Sarah, however, seemed to hang on every word, her face rapt. Her devotion escalated quickly, almost overnight, from enthusiasm to something Frank could only describe as fanaticism. Suddenly, everything in their lives, in their home, became a judgment. A new dress he admired was worldly temptation. The TV show they used to watch together was of the devil. Her old gym clothes were thrown out. Deemed immodest, she stopped having sex with him too. "It's lust, Frank," she'd said, turning away in bed. "We need to purify ourselves." The easy touch, the shared laughter, the simple comfort of their bodies together, it all vanished. Her makeup disappeared. Her favorite daring dresses, the ones that clung to her curves just so, found their way into the donation bin. She started wearing long, loose skirts and high-necked blouses. Even at home, her hair, once carefully styled, was now pulled back severely. Frank looked at her one morning, at the way her face seemed thinner, older, stripped bare of any artifice, and he thought, "You look like an old woman." "Sarah, The words caught in his throat, unsaid. He swallowed them, trying to be patient, trying to understand what was happening to his wife, to their life. Frank was a man of faith himself, raised in the quiet, steady rhythm of Sunday services and grace before meals. He believed in balance, in the simple tenets of hard work and honest living. Sarah's sudden extremism, this abrupt shedding of everything they had known, deeply troubled him. It wasn't just a change. It felt like an unraveling. One crisp autumn afternoon, he pulled his truck into the driveway, the engine still ticking as it cooled. What he saw stopped him cold. On their front lawn, spread on an old blanket, were pieces of their history. The ornate brass lamp from his grandmother, the small cedar chest Sarah's mother had given them, and, most painfully, Grandpa Jensen's clock, the tall, stately grandfather clock that had stood in their living room for as long as he could remember, its chimes marking the hours of his life. Sarah was haggling with a stranger, her voice low and earnest. "Sarah, what in God's name are you doing with Grandpa Jensen's clock?" Frank's voice was sharp with disbelief, louder than he intended. The stranger looked uncomfortable, quickly walking away with a small silver platter. Sarah turned, her eyes narrowed, a glint in them Frank didn't recognize. "Don't be a materialist, Frank. We'll have treasures in heaven. These earthly things mean nothing." Her voice was flat, dismissive. It cut deeper than anger. He wanted to yell, to snatch the clock back, to demand answers. But he saw the set of her jaw, the coldness in her eyes. He knew arguing wouldn't work. He bit back his anger, trying to accept it, to understand what he couldn't. "All right, love," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I'll try." He didn't know what else to say. Their quiet life, once predictable and calm, turned into a daily argument, unspoken or shouted. Frank questioned her faith, or what he saw as an all-consuming obsession. He tried to point out the inconsistencies, the way she had changed. But his words just bounced off her. Sarah, in turn, accused him of jealousy. "You're just jealous that I've found true purpose, Frank. You're persecuting me for my beliefs." "Sometimes." Her words escalated, laced with the fervent language of the church. "You're an agent of the devil, Frank, trying to pull me away from the Lord's path." The accusations stung, each one a fresh betrayal. He was her husband, the man who had loved her since she was 16. And now he was the enemy. Increasingly frustrated, and feeling her slip further away, Frank decided he needed to talk to Pastor Dale directly. He needed to understand what held such a grip on his wife, to appeal to the man he believed was responsible. He drove to the church one Tuesday afternoon, his stomach tight with apprehension. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw Pastor Dale emerge from the front doors, a wide smile on his face, shaking hands with a woman Frank didn't recognize. Then, Dale turned, his smile fading slightly as he saw Frank. He didn't acknowledge him, didn't even nod. Instead, he got into a sleek, dark sedan, a car Frank knew cost more than his entire house, and sped away, a cloud of dust in his wake, leaving Frank alone in the empty lot. Disheartened, Frank returned home. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He found Sarah in the kitchen, her back to him. She was hunched over the counter, stuffing wads of cash into a canvas bag. A quick glance showed him it was their joint savings, the emergency fund they'd slowly built up over years. "What's this for, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low, steady, trying to keep the tremor out of it. She didn't flinch, didn't even look up. "It's a donation, Frank. For the new church building. Everyone's giving their savings. It's for the Lord's work." Frank's face hardened. He felt the blood pound in his temples. "Are you taking our bread off the table for that man? For a fancy new building? This is too much, Sarah. This blind faith is going too far." His voice rose, the quiet control finally breaking. Sarah spun around, her eyes blazing. "It's not you talking, Frank. It's the devil," she shrieked, her face contorted. "Stop with the demons, Sarah," he yelled back, his own anger finally erupting. He slammed his fist on the counter, making the coffee cups rattle. "This is a lucid man, your husband, telling you you've gone crazy." The arguments, once simmering beneath the surface, now flared up daily. They were unbearable, tearing through the quiet fabric of their home. Frank felt his marriage crumbling, slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He couldn't stand the constant accusation, the coldness in her eyes. Something had to give. One morning, after a particularly silent breakfast, Frank put down his coffee cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the saucer. He looked at her, really looked at her, trying to find the Sarah he knew. "Listen, Sarah," he said, his voice low and firm, each word carefully chosen. "Either you ease up on this church, find some balance, or I'm asking for a divorce." The words felt heavy, a burden he never thought he'd have to speak. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide, aghast. For a moment, he thought he'd broken through, that she'd see the gravity of his ultimatum. "You'd destroy our marriage over faith?" she whispered, her voice tinged with a righteous indignation. "I'd rather keep my faith and gain salvation than let it go." She called him radical, which felt ironic coming from her. But Frank saw no compromise, no softening in her eyes. The chasm between them seemed to widen, deeper than ever. Still, Frank clung to hope, a stubborn, foolish part of him believing that maybe, just maybe, she'd reconsider. That the old Sarah, the one who loved him and their life, would resurface. The next evening, he walked into a shock. The scent of Sarah's favorite pot roast hung in the air, but sitting on their sofa, sipping iced tea, was Pastor Dale Peterson, impeccably dressed, a leather-bound Bible resting on the cushion beside him. Frank stood in the doorway, bewildered. "Pastor Dale?" "To what do I owe the honor?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, pushing down the surge of unease. Pastor Dale stood, extending a hand, his smile smooth. "Hello, Mr. Jensen. I'm here to help with the difficulties between you and Sarah." The way he said difficulties, the slight pause, implied Frank was the source of the trouble, that he was the one bringing the devil's work into their home. Frank, though embarrassed by the unexpected visit and the implication, tried to be polite. He was still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of sawdust and sweat. He explained his concerns, trying to articulate the changes in Sarah, the draining of their savings, the selling of heirlooms, all since she'd joined the church. Pastor Dale listened, nodding slowly, his expression one of calm understanding. Then, he launched into a Bible study, citing verses Frank had heard before, but twisting them, giving them a new, unsettling meaning. He claimed Frank misunderstood, that his worldly attachments were clouding his judgment, that the devil was poisoning his mind against God's true path. He spoke with such authority, such conviction, that for a moment, Frank almost doubted himself. But unlike Sarah, Frank wasn't easily swayed. He watched Dale's practiced gestures, the way his eyes held Sarah's with an almost hypnotic intensity. He kept his composure, though, unwilling to be rude to a man of God, especially in his own home. He simply listened, offering polite nods, his own thoughts churning beneath the surface. They sat through the long study, then shared an uncomfortable dinner, Pastor Dale dominating the conversation with parables and pronouncements. Finally, he rose to leave, his presence filling the doorway for a final moment before he departed, leaving behind a quiet, uneasy peace. For about a month after that, things seemed calmer. The arguments stopped. Sarah still went to church, but she stopped talking about it as much. She seemed less agitated, less fanatic. Frank thought maybe, just maybe, they'd found a way forward, a fragile truce. He even saw a flicker of the old Sarah in her eyes from time to time. One evening, Sarah made a wonderful dinner, roast chicken with potatoes, a meal she hadn't cooked in months. As they finished, she announced she was going out with friends. She was dressed beautifully, a soft blue dress that showed off her figure. And she had makeup on. Subtle but there, a look Frank hadn't seen in months. "You look lovely, Sarah," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "I'd like to see you like this more often." She turned, her hand on the doorknob, a strange, knowing smile on her lips. "Be patient, my love," she replied, her voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "Soon, we'll have fun again." Frank woke early the next day, the sun barely hinting at dawn through the bedroom curtains. A vague unease settled over him, a cold weight in his gut. He reached for Sarah, but her side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool. The house was too quiet, too empty. He padded into the living room, still half asleep. And that's when he saw it. Near the couch, half hidden beneath a throw pillow, was a small, embroidered handkerchief. It wasn't Sarah's. The fabric was too fine, the stitching too ornate, and emblazoned in a neat script were two initials, D.P. Frank's stomach tightened. A cold, hard knot. He remembered Pastor Dale's visit. The smooth talk, the way he'd looked at Sarah. He remembered Sarah's strange smile, the patience she spoke of. A cold dread, sharper than any chill, crept into him. It wasn't vague anymore. It was specific, precise. He decided then. He would follow her. He took his old pickup, the one he used for work, its dents and rust making it inconspicuous. He waited, parked a few blocks down, until he saw Sarah's small sedan pull out of the driveway. He gave her plenty of lead, just enough distance so she wouldn't spot him in her rearview mirror. She didn't go to the church. She drove past the turnoff, heading instead for the edge of town, past the diner and the auto body shop. She pulled into the parking lot of the Lucky Star Motel, the kind of place with peeling paint and hourly rates, a neon sign that buzzed even in the daylight. Frank's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He parked a few hundred yards down the road, behind a cluster of overgrown bushes, and watched. He didn't have to wait long. Minutes later, he saw it. Pastor Dale's familiar sleek car, pulling into the motel lot. Frank watched as Dale got out, glanced quickly around, and disappeared inside. He knew which room Sarah had gone into. He'd seen her. The cold dread turned into a suffocating pressure in his chest. A few moments later, the window shade in Sarah's room pulled down, a final, definitive gesture. Frank sat, numb, watching the clock on his dashboard tick by. Each second, a hammer blow. It felt like hours. It probably was. He didn't move. Couldn't move. He just watched, a hollow ache growing inside him. Finally, Pastor Dale emerged first. He adjusted his collar, ran a hand over his slicked back hair, and got into his car, pulling out of the lot with a practiced ease, not a glance back. Soon after, Sarah appeared. She looked different too. Not the frantic energy she'd had, nor the pious solemnity. This was a different kind of glow, not spiritual. She looked both satisfied and ashamed, a strange, terrible mix that tore at something deep inside Frank, his wife, his pastor. The words repeated in his head, a raw, tearing pain. He waited until she was almost home, just turning onto their street. Then he started his truck, put it in gear, and sped past her, arriving first. He ran inside, the handkerchief clutched tight in his hand, a plan already forming in his head, cold and precise. When Sarah walked in, the front door closing softly behind her, she saw Frank. He stood rigid in the living room, by the grandfather clock that wasn't Grandpa Jensen's anymore, holding the small, embroidered handkerchief. Her eyes widened as she recognized it, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "D.P.," Frank whispered, his voice dangerously calm, barely audible above the ringing in his ears. "Pastor Dale Peterson, isn't it?" Sarah's face, which a moment ago held a faint blush of exertion, drained of all color, leaving it pale and drawn. Her eyes darted away from his, settling on the embroidered handkerchief he still held. "Frank." "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice thin, a weak denial. "Don't lie to me, Sarah." Frank's voice was flat, each word a stone falling into a deep well. "I saw you. I saw him. At the motel. The Lucky Star." He watched her closely, saw the last vestige of composure crack. She broke. A sound tore from her throat, a ragged sob, and she collapsed onto the living room floor, her beautiful blue dress fanning out around her. Her hands flew to her face, trying to hide the tears that streamed down, wetting her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry," she cried, the words muffled by her hands. Frank felt no pity, only a cold, hard anger. "Sorry for what, Sarah? For the devil's work you were doing? For taking my money, my heirlooms, my trust, and giving it all to him, for lying to me, for making me feel like I was crazy. He walked over, standing above her, the handkerchief still clutched in his fist. She sobbed, trying to speak, the words coming in choked bursts. The affair had been going on for months, she finally confessed, the ugly truth spilling out. It started after Pastor Dale had begun counseling her, after their first arguments about the church had begun. He had sought her out, she said, offered guidance. He had convinced her, slowly, meticulously, that their marriage was worldly, a distraction from her true spiritual path. Their love, their life, was a tether holding her back from a higher calling, a path only he could guide her on. He had preyed on her vulnerability, her deep-seated desire for purpose, telling her that their physical connection, their illicit intimacy, was a higher connection, a spiritual bonding meant to transcend earthly desires. Frank listened, his mind reeling. A profound sadness mixed with a cold, clear rage. He loved this woman, had given up his dream of children for her, had tried to mend her brokenness. And all the while, this snake had been poisoning her mind, taking everything from them. He pictured Dale's smooth smile, his expensive car, his polished sermons. He told me. He said God wanted me to show my devotion through sacrifice, of everything, even my body. Sarah sobbed, her voice barely audible, echoing the words of the man who had twisted faith into something ugly and manipulative. Frank saw red. This wasn't just an affair, not a simple betrayal of the marital bed. This was a calculated spiritual and emotional assault, a systematic dismantling of his wife's mind and their life together. It was a theft of her agency. Cloaked in the sanctity of religion, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, to keep his voice level. You need to choose, Sarah, he said, the words cutting through her sobs. It's him, Pastor Dale and his twisted faith. Or what's left of our broken life. What's left of us. Sarah lifted her head, her face blotchy with tears, her eyes wide with a raw, desperate terror. The delusion, the fanaticism, seemed to have been stripped away, leaving her exposed and fragile. I don't know, Frank, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know what to do anymore. Frank left Sarah weeping on the floor, her confession echoing in the silent living room. Divorce wasn't his immediate thought. A colder, harder resolve had settled in. Justice, not just for him, but for Sarah. For everyone this man had manipulated. He started with Karen Walsh. He called her, asked to meet for coffee at the diner, keeping his voice calm, non-accusatory. He gently probed, asking about Pastor Dale, about the changes in the church, about others who seemed overly devoted. Karen, initially defensive, spoke of Pastor Dale's magnetism, the way he made everyone feel seen. But as Frank kept asking, listening more than talking, she slowly started to express doubts. She admitted she'd heard rumors, whispers about other women, about the church's finances, things that didn't quite sit right but that she'd pushed away as worldly temptation. Frank just nodded, encouraging her to speak, to let the doubts surface. Armed with Karen's hesitant revelations, Frank began his own digging. He started talking to former church members, people who had left after growing uneasy with Pastor Dale's teachings or his lavish spending. He spoke to people in town, the old-timers who had always found Pastor Dale a little too slick, too polished for their quiet community. The pieces, once scattered and disparate, began to connect. He learned Pastor Dale had a history. Not here, but in other small towns across the Midwest. Always the same pattern. He'd arrive, charismatic and charming, build a following, start collecting donations for some grand project, and then disappear, leaving a trail of broken families and emptied bank accounts. This new church building, the one Sarah had given their savings for, was a scam. The donations weren't funding a community project. They were feeding Pastor Dale's lavish lifestyle. His expensive cars, his tailored suits, his private trips. He also discovered that other women, lonely or vulnerable like Sarah, had also been drawn into Pastor Dale's spiritual guidance. Women who were searching for purpose, for connection, after personal tragedies or quiet despair. He used the same playbook, convincing them their marriages were worldly, that their bodies were meant for higher devotion, leading to similar betrayals, similar heartbreaks. Frank collected evidence. He tracked down financial records from the old church board members who had questioned Dale. He recorded testimonies from former congregants. He even found old newspaper clippings from other towns. The picture that emerged was stark, undeniable. He methodically built his case, a stack of papers and recordings growing on his kitchen table. He confronted Pastor Dale discreetly. He arranged a meeting at the church. After hours, when he knew it would be empty, he laid out the evidence on Dale's gleaming desk, a stack of undeniable facts. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, he just spoke, his voice calm, detailing everything he knew, everything he had proven. He demanded he cease his operations, return the stolen funds, and disappear from town for good. Pastor Dale, initially arrogant, sneering at Frank for daring to question him, turned visibly pale as Frank presented the evidence. The smooth facade crumbled. He tried to bribe Frank, offering him a substantial sum to keep quiet, to make it all go away. When Frank refused, Dale's demeanor shifted, becoming menacing. He threatened Frank, his family, anyone who dared to expose him. "You lay a hand on me, or Sarah, or anyone else," Frank warned, his voice like cold steel, unwavering. "And every single person in this county will know exactly what you are." Frank didn't wait for Dale to respond. He walked out, went straight to the local authorities, and presented them with the overwhelming evidence of fraud and spiritual abuse. The police, initially skeptical, quickly realized the depth of the deception. The story broke in the small-town paper just a few days later, a front-page headline that shook the entire community. Pastor Dale Peterson, the charming man of God, was revealed as a con artist, a spiritual predator, and an adulterer. The news hit the town like a prairie storm, ripping through the quiet community. The small paper, usually filled with local bake sales and county fair announcements, sold out instantly. Pastor Dale Peterson, the charismatic man who had promised salvation, was revealed to be nothing more than a con artist and an adulterer. Sarah, Frank's wife, was at the center of the scandal. She was ostracized, her reputation shattered, the whispers following her like a shadow even when she left the house. Many of Pastor Dale's followers were left devastated. Their faith, once so fervent, was shaken to its core. Their savings, faithfully given for a new church building that would never be, were simply gone. The shame and disillusionment hung heavy over the town. Pastor Dale was arrested, facing multiple charges of fraud, and possibly worse. Justice, in some form, was being served. Frank finally faced Sarah again, in the quiet of their living room. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of all her former fanaticism, and now, too, of her pride. The anger that had fueled him began to recede, replaced by a deep, weary ache. She looked small, lost. "What now, Frank?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, barely audible in the quiet room. Her gaze was fixed on him, desperate for an answer. Frank looked at the barren woman he loved, the woman who had chosen a charlatan over him, over their shared life, over everything they had built. He felt the immense weight of it all, the lost years, the vanished dreams, the crushing betrayal. He could divorce her. He could walk away, rebuild his own life, find someone new. The thought was tempting, a clean break from the wreckage. But something in him, a stubborn Midwestern loyalty, a deep-seated belief in enduring, held him. It wasn't love in the passionate, storybook sense anymore. Not exactly, but a deeper, more rooted connection, like old oak roots tangled in the earth. "It's a long road back, Sarah," he said, his voice tired, the words slow and deliberate. "A real long road. But you gotta walk it, and you gotta walk it clean." It was an offer, a conditional one, heavy, with unspoken expectations. Sarah started attending a different church, a small, humble one on the outskirts of town, where the sermons were about simple grace and quiet community, not spectacle or personal power. She sought genuine solace, not the false promises of grandeur. She started working again, taking a job at the local library, trying to rebuild some semblance of a life, away from the gossip and judgment that still followed her everywhere else. Frank watched, at first from a distance, then, slowly, closer. The trust was gone, or at least deeply fractured, replaced by a quiet, watchful hope that she would find her way back, not to him, but to herself. The dream of children was well and truly dead, a quiet casualty of all that had transpired. It had been replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of what their life had become. Frank and Sarah Jensen faced an uncertain future, side by side, yet each on their own journey. They were bound not by the passionate love they once had, not by the easy comfort of shared dreams, but by the shared ashes of their past and the grim, quiet work of surviving in the wake of such profound betrayal. It wasn't a happy ending, not in the storybook sense where all wounds are healed and forgotten, but in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the heartland. Sometimes, just enduring was enough. The dust settled slowly, much like the quiet despair across the Utah landscape. Pastor Dale's arrest became a brief, grim legend in the town's history. Another cautionary tale. Sarah, stripped of her fervent glow, learned what it meant to walk among shadows, carrying the weight of public judgment and private shame. She moved through her days with a subdued grace, the vibrant woman Frank once knew replaced by someone more muted, more careful. Frank watched, his hope a fragile, new thing, not rooted in passion, but in the quiet strength of habit and shared history. The dream of children, once so vivid, was now a dried-up well in their shared past. Their marriage was not resurrected, but rebuilt, piece by careful piece, like a foundation after a storm. It was a union forged in the ashes of betrayal, held together by a shared determination to simply endure. There was no grand forgiveness, no sudden return to joy, just the quiet, persistent effort of two people living out their days in a world that had shown them its harsh edges. Sometimes, in that land, that was the only kind of victory there was.